the shadowy figure lurking inside the abandoned house. In a secluded Vietnamese village, a family tragedy unfolds laced with elements of horror, karma, and dark secrets. It begins with the harsh, greedy family of Mr. Dean harassing a poor widow, Emma, for a small debt. Their relentless torment drives Emma to desperation, and in a horrifying turn, she strangles her young, malnourished son before taking her own life. This sinister event marks the beginning of a haunting spiral that engulfs the Dean family. Their lives soon descend into chaos. Mr. Dean's sons, Jake and Leo, experience disturbing paranormal occurrences when they trespass on the land of the dead family. These hauntings grow more intense, leading to bizarre accidents and untimely deaths. Despite their greed-fueled triumph in acquiring Emma's land, the Deans find themselves ensnared by a malevolent force. As they set out to build on the cursed ground, they are haunted by the apparitions of the mother and son they had driven to death. The final act of this chilling tale culminates in a sequence of suicides and madness that decimate the once powerful Dean family, leaving only echoes of their greed and the spectral cries of their victims. Part 1. The Dead. In a small, isolated village, whispers of misfortune and suffering travel on the wind. At the center of it all stood Mr. Dean, a man known for his wealth and cruelty. His house, towering and pristine, starkly contrasted with the decaying homes surrounding it. But it wasn't just his material wealth that made people wary. It was his heart, cold as stone and as unyielding as iron. Mr. Dean was relentless when it came to collecting debts, and his current prey was a poor widow named Emma. Emma lived on the outskirts of the village in a dilapidated shack, barely holding itself together. The walls were crumbling, and the roof had gaping holes patched with plastic sheets that did little to keep the rain out. Inside it was dark and damp, with only a few meager belongings scattered across the dirt floor. Emma's husband had died recently, leaving her to care for their frail, sickly son David. Emma's eyes were hollow, the weight of her grief etched into every line on her face. She was exhausted from toiling day and night, trying to find a way to provide for David. Her son was small for his age, his body emaciated and his limbs thin as sticks. His head was disproportionately large, giving him an eerie appearance. Malnutrition and illness had made him fragile, and Emma constantly worried about his health. Despite her best efforts, their life was a constant struggle, and the recent loss of her husband had left them on the brink of despair. Yet there was still a glimmer of hope in Emma's heart, a faint belief that things might get better if only they could survive each day. But Mr. Dean's shadow loomed over them, casting darkness on whatever hope Emma had left. The debt she owed him was small, just a few million dong that she had borrowed to cover her husband's funeral expenses. It was a sum that seemed insignificant to a man like Mr. Dean, who had money in abundance. Yet to Emma, it was an insurmountable mountain, especially with no income and a sick child to care for. And to Mr. Dean, it wasn't about the money, it was about power, control, and feeding his insatiable cruelty. Almost every day, Mr. Dean would show up at Emma's door, accompanied by his wife, Mrs. Dean, and their two sons, Jake and Leo. They were like a pack of wolves, circling their prey, their eyes gleaming with malice. "Where's my money?" Emma Mr. Dean would bark, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You think you can just hide in this filthy hole and avoid paying what you owe Mrs. Dean wasn't any kinder?" She would sneer, her eyes narrowing with contempt. "She's probably just lazy. Look at her. Can't even afford to dress decently, let alone pay her debts." Pathetic, she spat on the ground, as if the very sight of Emma disgusted her. Their sons were no better. Jake and Leo would stand there, smirking, their faces twisted with the same malicious glee that their parents wore. "Why don't you just sell that useless kid of yours?" Jake sneered one day. "Might fetch enough to clear the debt," Leo snickered in agreement, their laughter ringing in Emma's ears like a death knell. Each visit was a brutal assault, a barrage of insults and threats that left Emma trembling long after they had gone. Her hands would shake as she held David close, his small body trembling against hers. "Mommy, are they going to take me away?" he would ask in a weak, quavering voice. Emma's heart shattered each time she had to reassure him, even as fear and hopelessness gnawed at her insides. "I won't let them take you, my love," she would whisper, pressing her lips to his forehead. But how could she protect him? With each passing day, the weight of their threats crushed her spirit a little more. One night, after a particularly vicious visit, Emma collapsed onto the floor, clutching her head as the room spun around her. The Deans had been especially cruel that day. Mr. Dean had kicked the door open, splintering the already fragile wood. "You filthy wretch," he screamed, advancing on her. "You think we're going to let this slide? I want my money, and if you don't have it, then you better start praying for a miracle, because I will make your life a living hell." Emma had cowered in the corner, shielding David with her body as Mrs. Dean heard more insults, calling her a parasite, a useless burden on society. Jake and Leo had laughed and jeered, banging on the walls and windows, making the house tremble. They left only after Mr. Dean had promised to return the next day, with even more rage if she still couldn't pay. As the echoes of their taunts faded, the silence that followed was filled with a suffocating dread. Emma sobbed quietly, her body racked with shudders. How had her life come to this? She thought of her husband, of the love they had shared, of the future they had dreamed of for their son. But all of that was gone now, buried in the cold, unfeeling earth. What remained was this: a constant state of fear of being hunted by the Deans like prey. Days passed, each one a repetition of the last. The Deans came, spewing hatred and violence, and Emma cowered, helpless to change her fate. David grew weaker, his frail body unable to withstand the constant stress and malnutrition. Emma sold what little they had, hoping to scrape together enough to pay off the debt, but it was never enough. Mr. Dean was ruthless, adding interest to the sum owed with every passing week, ensuring that she would never be able to repay it. Emma's mind began to unravel. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Mr. Dean's voice, felt his presence looming over her. She began to see shadows moving in the corners of the room, dark shapes that whispered her failures and taunted her with her son's impending doom. Her heart pounded with panic, her thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and despair. One evening, as the sun set and the room was bathed in the blood-red light of dusk, Emma sat with David on the bed. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow. She ran her fingers through his hair, trying to soothe him as he whimpered in pain. "I'm so sorry, my sweet boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry I couldn't do more for you outside." The wind howled, and she could hear the distant sound of Mr. Dean's voice. They were coming again. Her chest tightened and her vision blurred. No more, she thought. I can't let them hurt us anymore. A strange calm set over her, the kind that comes when one finally accepts the inevitable. She stood and crossed the room to a corner where an old, worn rope lay coiled. Her hand shook as she picked it up, feeling its rough texture against her skin. She turned to look at David, her heart breaking as she gazed at his fragile form. "Forgive me," she mouthed that, knowing he couldn't hear her. In that moment, Emma's mind fractured. The fear, the torment, the hopelessness, it all coalesced into a single, terrible decision. If they couldn't escape Mr. Dean in life, then maybe, just maybe, they could in death. With a grim determination, she approached the bed, the rope held tightly in her hands. David stirred, opening his eyes to look up at his mother. "Mommy," he whispered weakly. Emma's lips quivered, her vision blurring with tears as she knelt beside him. "Hush now, my love," she croaked, choking back a sob. "It's going to be okay, I promise. No one will hurt us anymore." And with that, the room was filled with a heart-wrenching silence, followed by a single, strangled cry that was quickly snuffed out. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness claimed the house. The next morning, when the villagers came to check on Emma after hearing the commotion the previous day, they found the door ajar. Inside, the air was cold, thick with an unnatural stillness. It didn't take them long to discover the tragic scene: Emma hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently in the air with her lifeless son lying on the bed, his eyes open but unseeing. Whispers spread through the village like wildfire. Some blamed Mr. Dean, cursing his cruelty. Others shook their heads, muttering about fate and misfortune. But Mr. Dean felt no remorse. If anything, he was pleased. "She deserved it," he spat when he heard the news. "That's what happens when you can't pay your debts in the coming days." He would seize the land where Emma had lived, preparing to build anew. Little did he know, his greed and cruelty had stirred something far darker, something that would not rest until it had claimed him and his family in a way that no one could ever have foreseen. Part 2. The last meal. The air inside Emma's dilapidated home was thick with despair, a palpable gloom that settled over everything like a heavy fog. The feeble candlelight flickered on the uneven walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance in mocking shades. It was early evening. and a cold wind whistled through the gaps in the broken window panes, filling the room with a biting chill. Emma shivered as she stood over the tiny stove, stirring a small pot of thin soup. The meager meal was all she could afford for her son that night. The cupboard was bare, and her pockets were empty. She glanced over at David, sitting on the floor with his legs crossed, his frail body hunched forward. His large eyes were sunken and hollow, reflecting his hunger and exhaustion. He stared at the pot, his lips parted slightly in anticipation of the meager meal. Emma's heart ached as she watched him, a wave of guilt and sadness washing over her. This was not the life she had dreamed of for him. Her eyes burned with tears, but she blinked them away, unwilling to let her son see her break down. "Almost ready, my love," she said, her voice trembling. She forced a smile as she ladled a small portion of the soup into a cracked bowl. It wasn't much, just a watery broth with a few bits of vegetables, but she pretended it was a feast. "Tonight, we have a special treat," she added, trying to sound cheerful, though her chest felt as if it were being crushed under an immense weight. David nodded weakly, his lips forming a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He was too tired, too weak to do more. Emma carried the bowl to him and set it down on the floor. She knelt beside him, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Eat up, darling," she whispered. "It will make you strong." As David picked up the spoon with trembling hands and began to eat, Emma watched him intently. Each slow, deliberate movement of the spoon to his mouth was like a dagger to her heart. How had it come to this? She had once been full of hope, filled with dreams of a future where her son would grow up healthy and happy. Now, every mouthful he swallowed seemed to drain the last of her will to live. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the muffled sounds of shouting. Emma froze there, her blood running cold. The Deans. They were back, as they had promised. She could hear Mr. Dean's booming voice, filled with venomous fury. "Where's our money, Emma? You can't hide forever. Come out here and face us." Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands shook uncontrollably. She glanced at David, who had paused with the spoon halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with fear. "Mommy." "They're here again," he whispered, his voice quivering. Emma forced a smile, though her lips trembled. "It's okay, sweetie," she murmured, wrapping an arm around his thin shoulders. "Just keep eating. Don't worry about them." Inside, though, a storm raged. Panic, fear, and anger churned together, twisting her thoughts into a dark, spilling maelstrom. The shouting outside grew louder, more insistent. Mrs. Dean's shrill voice pierced the air, dripping with scorn. "You think you can ignore us, you filthy parasite? Come out and pay what you owe, or we'll drag you out ourselves." Emma's breath came in ragged gasps. They wouldn't stop. They would never stop. No matter how many times she pleaded, no matter how many nights she spent crying and praying for mercy, they would always return, demanding what she could not give. And with each visit, they chipped away at what little hope and strength she had left. David's spoon clattered against the bowl as he fumbled with it, his hands too weak to maintain a grip. Emma's eyes flickered to him, her heart breaking at the sight of his frailty. He was so small, so fragile. His ribs showed through the thin fabric of his shirt, his skin pale and tall over his bones. The life was draining out of him, slowly but surely, as he withered under the weight of their circumstances. A sudden, crushing realization hit her like a wave. There was no way out. No matter how hard she tried, she would never be able to escape this cycle of misery. Mr. Dean would continue to torment them until there was nothing left. She could see it now, David growing weaker each day, fading away until he was nothing but a hollow shell. And she, powerless to save him, would be left alone in this wretched world, bereft of everything that mattered. No, she couldn't let that happen. A fierce protectiveness surged within her, mingled with a cold, grim resolve. If she couldn't save David in life, then she would save him in death. It was the only way to free them both from this nightmare. The thought terrified her, but at the same time it brought an eerie sense of calm. She reached out and stroked David's hair, her hand trembling. "Do you trust me, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David nodded slowly, his eyes shining with an innocence that tore at her soul. "Then close your eyes," he said softly. "Everything will be okay, I promise." David hesitated, confusion flickering across his gaunt face, but he obeyed, trusting his mother implicitly. Emma felt her heart shatter as he closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and uneven. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with the sobs she refused to let escape. This was the only way. It had to be. With a final, shuddering breath, she took the rope that lay beside the stove, its rough texture biting into her palm. She looped it around her hands, her movements mechanical, as if guided by a force outside herself. Her vision blurred with tears as she turned back to her son, his small body huddled on the floor, so vulnerable and defenseless. "I love you," she choked out, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I love you more than anything in this world." And then, before she could second guess herself, before she could allow her heart to break further, she moved behind him, her hands closing around his thin neck. David's eyes flew open in shock, and he gasped, his small hands clawing at her wrists in a desperate attempt to breathe. His eyes locked onto hers, wide with confusion and fear. "Mommy." "Why?" he rasped, his voice strangled. Emma's heart screamed in agony, but she tightened her grip, her face twisted in a mask of grief and determination. "Shay, it's okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's going to be okay." David's struggles weakened, his body convulsing as the life drained out of him. Emma held on, her soul tearing apart with every passing second. She watched the light fade from his eyes, her tears falling onto his ashen cheeks. Then it was over. His body went limp in her arms, his head slumping forward. Emma collapsed to the floor, clutching him to her chest, her sobs racking her entire frame. "I'm so sorry," she wailed, rocking back and forth. "I'm so sorry, my baby. I had to. The room fell silent, the only sound the howling wind outside. Emma sat there for what felt like an eternity, cradling her son's lifeless form, her tears soaking into his hair. The candle on the stove guttered, casting a faint, flickering light across the room. Finally, with great effort, she lifted her head, her eyes vacant and glassy. It wasn't enough to free David. She had to free herself too. Slowly, mechanically, she rose to her feet, the rope trailing from her hand like a sinister serpent. She moved towards the sailing beam, her steps heavy and unsteady. She tossed the rope over the beam and tied a knot, her fingers moving with a cold, detached precision. Her mind was blank, her body numb. There was nothing left to feel, nothing left to hope for. This was the end. She stepped onto the chair, her movements slow and deliberate, as if in a trance. The world around her blurred, the shadows closing in, whispering to her, urging her on. She slipped the noose over her head and tightened it around her neck. One last look at her son, lying peacefully on the floor. One last breath. "I'll be with you soon," she murmured, her voice barely audible. And then, with a swift kick, she sent the chair toppling over. The rope snapped taut, and for a brief moment, she felt a searing pain, a flash of regret. But then, darkness closed in, and she fell into the void, leaving behind the wall of suffering and despair. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of her final act, the grim silence that followed, marking the end of a tragic struggle. The Deans, still shouting and cursing, were unaware of what had just transpired inside the small, dilapidated house. It was only when the village arrived the next morning, drawn by an uneasy stillness, that they found the horrific scene. Emma and her son were gone, claimed by a fate too cruel to comprehend. And in the silence of that room, a darkness lingered, waiting to spread its curse. Part 3. The Aftermath. The village woke that morning to a chill in the air, one that sank into the bones and whispered of tragedy. Rumors spread like wildfire, crackling through the narrow alleys and seeping into every home. Eyes filled with dread, villagers whispered behind closed doors about the terrible scene found inside Emma's ramshackle house. Emma and her son David were dead, lifeless and cold in that crumbling, lonely space. The shock of their passing hit the village like a storm, leaving everyone in its wake reeling. Some had ventured to the house out of concern, others out of curiosity. What they found was horrifying Emma, hanging from the ceiling beam, her lifeless body swaying gently in the frigid air. Her eyes were closed, her face frozen in an expression of pain and peace, as if in her final moments she had found some small solace. And there on the floor below her lay David, his tiny body sprawled motionless, his eyes staring blankly into the void. The marks on his neck, the bruises left by Emma's desperate grip, told a story too dark for words. The villagers recoiled in horror at the sight, some covering their mouths to stifle gasps of disbelief, others clutching their children to their chests. Grief swept over them like a wave, mingled with a sense of helplessness and guilt. They had watched Emma's decline, witnessed the cruelty of the Dean family, yet no one had stepped forward to help. Now all they could do was mourn. News of the tragedy spread quickly, and within hours, the entire village buzzed with grim speculation. How could things have gone so terribly wrong? How could a mother, driven to such desperate lengths, take the life of her own child before ending her own? Whispers filled the streets, tales of death and torment, of a woman broken by the relentless cruelty of the Deans. They hounded her to death, an old woman muttered bitterly, her eyes gleaming with anger as she stood among a group of villagers. That poor girl. They wouldn't leave her be, not until they sucked every last bit of hope from her. Monsters, all of them another spat, especially Mr. Dean. That man has no soul, no heart. He's a vulture, feasting on the misery of others. But amidst the hushed conversations and shared grief, one family remained utterly untouched, unmoved by the horror that had unfolded. In the Dean household, there was no talk of tragedy, no trace of regret or sorrow. Instead, there was only a cold, calculating greed that simmered just beneath the surface. Mr. Dean stood at the window of his grand home, looking out towards the decrepit structure that had once been Emma's. His lips curled into a thin, predatory smile. To him, Emma's death wasn't a tragedy, it was an opportunity. Well, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, the land's hours now returned to face his family, his eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that sent a chill down even his wife's spine. Mrs. Dean regarded him silently for a moment, then nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Yes, she agreed, her voice smooth and cold. We did warn her, didn't we? Told her what would happen if she didn't pay up. She made her choice. Their sons, Jake and Leo, exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of amusement and contempt. So what's the plan? Dad Jake asked, his voice laced with eagerness. Do we tear that dump down today? Mr. Dean walked slowly to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a deliberate calmness. He steepled his fingers, his eyes narrowed in thought. Not just yet, he replied, his tone measured. We need to make sure the land is properly secured first. We don't want any legal complications, Jake and Leo nodded, smirking as they imagined the house being demolished, replaced with something new, something grander. Emma's suffering was a distant memory, a mere stepping stone to what they now saw as their gain. It wasn't long before Mr. Dean began the process of claiming Emma's land. With her death, and with no relatives to contest the property, it was an easy enough task. He worked quickly, pushing paperwork through the village authorities, ensuring everything was legally in place for him to seize the plot. And he did so without a shred of remorse, feeling no guilt for the part he had played in the tragic events. The villagers watched in stunned silence as Mr. Dean moved in to claim the land. Many were angered, their stomachs churning with disgust at his cold-heartedness. He's a vulture, they muttered. How can he be so shameless, so callous? But while the villagers grumbled and shook their heads, none dared confront him. Mr. Dean was powerful, influential. His wealth and connections gave him a fearsome authority that no one wanted to challenge. Yet, despite their silence, an unease began to fester in the village. It was as if the very ground where Emma's house had stood had absorbed the agony of her final moments, the despair of a mother and child driven to death. The air around the property seemed heavier, colder, and an ominous presence hung over it, like a shroud that couldn't be lifted. That place is cursed, an elderly man remarked one afternoon, his eyes fixed on the plot of land where Emma's house still stood, untouched since the tragic event. No good will come of it. Mark my words, you can't build on suffering and expect peace. Superstition, a younger villager scoffed. But even as he spoke, he glanced nervously at the house, as if half expecting to see Emma's ghost staring back at him from the shadows. Mr. Dean, however, paid no mind to such talk. To him, it was all nonsense stories told by fools to scare children. He pressed on with his plans, hiring workers to begin the demolition of the old, rotting structure. As he stood on the edge of the property, overseeing the first steps of construction, he felt a sense of triumph. The land was his now, and soon it would be transformed into something new, something befitting his stature. But as the workers arrived to tear down the house, a chill settled over the site, a coldness that seeped into their bones despite the warm sun overhead. They exchanged uneasy glances, shifting their feet as they waited for orders. You feel that one of them muttered, rubbing his arms to ward off the inexplicable chill. Something's not right here, shut up, his partner snapped, though he too couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It's just an old house. Get a grip. Still, as the demolition began, the air grew thick with tension. Dust and debris filled the space where the house once stood, but it was more than just the physical remnants being disturbed. It was as if something deeper, something unseen, was being unearthed along with the foundation of the building. The workers moved cautiously, their movements jerky and hurried, wanting to finish the job and leave as quickly as possible. From the safety of his home, Mr. Dean watched the proceedings with satisfaction. "It's finally happening," he murmured, rubbing his hands together. "That eyesore will be gone soon, and in its place something far more worthy of this land." But his wife, standing behind him, felt a shiver run down her spine. She glanced at the side, at the workers moving like shadows in the gathering dusk. "Do you think it's wise?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with a rare hint of uncertainty. "That place. What if the villagers are right? What if it's cursed?" Mr. Dean turned to her sharply, his eyes blazing with contempt. "Cursed," he scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a piece of land, nothing more. Superstition is for fools." He turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the side. "Soon, this will all be ours. And no ghost story is going to stop that." Mrs. Dean said nothing more, though unease gnawed at her insides. She could almost feel the weight of the land's dark history pressing against her, a foreboding that settled like a heavy stone in her gut. As days passed, the demolition continued, though strange incidents began to occur. Tools would go missing, equipment would malfunction, and an unsettling quiet would fall over the site each evening as dusk approached. The workers spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of shadows moving just at the edge of their vision, of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I saw how one of the workers confided to his friend one night, his face pale. "I swear I saw Emma standing in the corner of the plot, just staring. When I turned to look, she was gone, but I felt it, like something was watching us." "Shut up," the other hissed, glancing around nervously. "Don't talk about that here. We're just here to work and get paid. Nothing more." But even as they tried to brush off the stories, a sense of dread hung over the construction site, an invisible force that tightened around them like a vice. The villagers watched from a distance, their expressions a mix of fear and anticipation. They whispered among themselves, wondering what fate awaited the Deans for their heartless actions. And within the Dean household, a crack began to form. Mrs. Dean could sense it, an invisible fracture in the fabric of their lives. At night she would lie awake, listening to the creaks and groans of their old house, every sound magnified in the darkness. Mr. Dean, however, remained oblivious, his mind solely focused on the future that the new property would bring. "It will be magnificent," he told his sons one evening, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "This land will become the cornerstone of our legacy." But as he spoke, a gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the lights to flicker. The room fell into an uneasy silence, and for a brief moment Mr. Dean felt a chill run down his spine. He shook it off quickly, dismissing it as nothing more than a stray draft. Little did he know, the darkness that had taken root in the village was only beginning to stir. Emma's land was no longer just a plot of earth to be built upon. It had become a place of unrest, a haunting ground filled with the echoes of despair and suffering. And soon, the Dean family would learn that some things could not be buried, no matter how much they tried to erase the past. Part 4. A sinister plan. The sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long, twisted shadows over the village. Darkness crept in, swallowing the crumbling remains of Emma's old house, now an empty shell of its former self. It stood like a silent monument to tragedy, its walls soaked in the memories of anguish and death. The villagers avoided it, crossing to the other side of the road when they had to pass by, muttering prayers under their breath. But for Mr. Dean, it was an opportunity, a twisted opportunity that he intended to exploit fully. The next phase of Mr. Dean's plan involved making sure that the value of the surrounding properties remained low. He wanted to acquire more land without spending more than he deemed necessary. His eyes gleamed with greed as he plotted to drive away any potential buyers who might be interested in the neighboring plots. The key was to make the area seem cursed, haunted even, so that no one would dare think of investing in it. Late one evening, as the wind howled outside and the chill of night settled over the village, Mr. Dean called his sons, Jake and Leo, into his study. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting eerie shadows that flickered across the walls. Jake and Leo entered, exchanging curious glances. They knew their father was scheming, but they had no idea of the extent of his new plan. "Boys," Mr. Dean began, his voice a low rumble, "I need you to help me with something special." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "We're going to make sure that no one wants to buy the land near Emma's place. And to do that, we're going to have to get..." Creative Jake raised an eyebrow. a hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "What do you have in mind?" Daddy asked, already eager for some mischief. Leo shifted uneasily beside him, glancing at his father with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Dean pulled a small, old-fashioned mobile phone from his pocket and placed it on the table. The screen was cracked and its edges were worn, but it still worked. "We're going to rig this phone with a recording," he explained. "A haunting wail, something to make the place seem unnatural. We'll hide it inside what's left of the house, and when we call it from another phone, it will play the recording. Trust me, it'll send chills down the spine of anyone who hears it." Jake's eyes lit up with excitement. "That's brilliant," he said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "No one's going to want to buy land near a haunted house," Leo, however, frowned, unease twisting his stomach. "I don't know," Daddy muttered, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "That place. It already feels creepy enough." "Do we really need to make it worse?" Mr. Dean shot him a cold glare, silencing his doubts. "Do you want this land or not?" he snapped, his voice sharp as a knife. "If you're too scared, then go back to your room. But don't come whining to me later when we miss out on a fortune." Leo bit his lip, glancing at Jake, who gave him a mocking smirk. "What's the matter? Scared of a little ghost toy?" Jake taunted, nudging him. "Come on, it'll be fun. Besides, it's just a phone with a recording. There's no such thing as ghosts." With a sigh, Leo nodded reluctantly. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's just get this over with." Satisfied, Mr. Dean handed them the phone and the instructions. "Wait until it's completely dark," he ordered. "Then sneak into the house and plant the phone. Hide it somewhere it won't be easily found. I'll be back here, ready to call it as soon as you're done." The plan was set. As the night deepened, the village settled into an uneasy silence. Jake and Leo slipped out of their house, dressed in dark clothes, the phone clutched in Jake's hand. They moved quietly, sticking to the shadows as they made their way to Emma's abandoned home. The air grew colder as they approached, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Leo shivered, rubbing his arms, but Jake pressed on, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of the house looming ahead. "Come on," Jake whispered harshly, glancing back at his brother. "Don't be such a baby. It's just an empty house." Leo swallowed hard, his eyes darting around nervously. The house loomed before them, its windows like dark, hollow eyes staring into their souls. The wind rustled the overgrown weeds around the foundation, creating an eerie, whispering sound. Despite his fear, Leo followed his brother to the door, which hung ajar, creaking slightly as they pushed it open. Inside, the house was pitch black, the faint starlight from outside barely penetrating the gloom. A musty, stale odor filled the air, mixed with a lingering scent of decay. Leo gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, while Jake moved forward with grim determination. "Where should we put it?" Jake asked, his voice low and hushed, though it seemed to echo off the empty walls. "You under the bed," Leo stammered, pointing towards the corner of the room where a broken, rickety bed frame stood, its mattress slumped and covered in dust. "Perfect," Jake replied, his voice dripping with mockery. "The perfect place for a ghost to hide." He knelt down and slid the phone under the bed, positioning it so it was hidden from view. His fingers brushed against the floor, and for a moment he felt a strange icy chill, as though the wood itself was seeping cold into his skin. He jerked his hand back, glancing around. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice tight. Leo frowned, stepping back and shaking his head. "Feel what?" he asked nervously, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Shadows seemed to shift and sway, as if something was moving just out of sight. "Never mind," Jake muttered, shaking off the uneasy feeling. "Let's just get out of here." But as they turned to leave, a soft, almost imperceptible sound echoed through the room. It was a faint creaking, like wood bending under weight. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly he turned his head towards the corner of the room, where the bed stood. That's when he saw it. A figure, thin, pale, and twisted, was peering at him from behind the bed. Its eyes were wide and hollow, gleaming with a sickly yellow light. Its mouth hung open in a grotesque silent scream. The lips stretched impossibly wide. Jake's heart lurched in his chest, a surge of icy terror flooding his veins. His mouth went dry, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak. Jake, Leo's voice trembled beside him. What are you looking at?" But Jake couldn't respond. The figure moved, just slightly, its head tilting to the side, as if studying him, its mouth twitching into a macabre grin. Then, with a sudden jerky motion, it lurched forward, its hand pale, Skeletor reaching out towards him. "Run," Jake screamed, his voice breaking through the paralyzing fear. He grabbed Leo's arm and yanked him towards the door. They stumbled out into the night, their hearts pounding in their chests as they sprinted away from the house. The darkness around them seemed to close in, the wind howling in their ears, but they didn't dare look back. Behind them, in the house, the phone lay beneath the bed, silent and waiting. And in the shadows, something watched them flee, its eyes gleaming with a cold, malevolent light. When they finally burst through the door of their own house, gasping for breath, Mr. Dean was waiting for them, his eyes narrowed in a mixture of anger and confusion. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Did you plant the phone or not?" Jake and Leo stood there, panting, their faces pale and slick with sweat. "Yeah," Jake managed to gasp out. We put it under the bed," but he trailed off, unable to find the words to describe what he had seen. "But what?" Mr. Dean snapped, growing impatient. Leo opened his mouth, his eyes wide with lingering terror. "There was something in there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something watching us. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human." Mr. Dean scowled, dismissing their fear with a wave of his hand. "Nonsense," he barked. "There's nothing in that house except dust and rot. You're letting your imaginations run wild." He turned away, grabbing his own phone from the table. "Now, let's see if this plan of ours will work." With a flick of his thumb, he dialed the number of the phone they had planted in the house. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Jake and Leo exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding in their chests. They half expected nothing to happen, hoped that it was all just a trick of their minds. Then, from the phone speaker, a wail filled the room, a low, haunting moan that grew louder and more twisted with each passing second. It seeped into the walls, snaking through the shadows, filling every corner with its chilling echo. Jake and Leo shuddered, their skin crawling as the sound pierced their ears, dredging up memories of the figure they had seen. And somewhere, deep within that sound, they could hear something else, a whisper, faint but clear, as if it were coming from the very heart of the darkness they had fled. "You shouldn't have." Calm, the words sent a jolt of terror through them, freezing their blood. Mr. Dean, however, merely chuckled, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Perfect," he muttered. Absolutely perfect, but as he turned away, a gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows and plunging the room into an unnatural coldness. The lights flickered, and for a split second, Jake caught a glimpse of something reflected in the glass, a twisted face, grinning with hollow eyes. He staggered back, his mouth opening in a silent scream, but when he looked again, it was gone. Only the reflection of the room remained, bathed in a sickly yellow light. And outside, from the shadows of Emma's old house, a dark figure watched and waited, its presence growing stronger with every wail that echoed through the night. Part 5. The haunting begins. The construction site was deathly silent as the workers arrived the next morning. It was the kind of silence that filled one's ears with an almost unbearable pressure, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The cold wind swept across the barren plot of land where Emma's house once stood, biting through the workers' clothes and sending chills down their spines. It wasn't supposed to be this cold, not in the middle of summer. The air was thick with an unnatural tension, a quiet unease that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Mr. Dean, however, brushed off the peculiar atmosphere. He stood at the edge of the site, overseeing the project with a determined gaze. "I want this place cleared by the end of the week," he ordered. "No delays. We're on a schedule, and I don't want to hear any excuses." The workers nodded, though they exchanged nervous glances. Ever since they had started demolishing the old house, things had begun to feel wrong. It was hard to explain a creeping sensation that something unseen was watching them, lurking just beyond their field of vision. But none of them dared voice their fears. They needed the money, and Mr. Dean was not a man to be trifled with. Jake and Leo arrived shortly after their father, their expressions tense and guarded. They hadn't spoken about what had happened that night in the abandoned house since it occurred, each too fearful to confront the chilling memories of what they had seen. Yet, as they stepped onto the site, a familiar wave of dread washed over them, sending an icy shiver down their spines. "You okay?" Leo asked. Glancing at his brother, he could see the unease in Jake's eyes, the tightness in his jaw. Jake scoffed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Of course, it's just a stupid old house, remember," but even as he said it, his voice wavered, betraying the fear that gnawed at him. They both knew this was more than just nerves. The work progressed slowly. Machines roared and dust filled the air as the workers tore into the entire remaining debris of Emma's house. But it wasn't long before strange things started to happen. At first it was small, barely noticeable events, tools that went missing only to turn up in bizarre places, equipment that malfunctioned without explanation, lights flickering on and off. Then, as the days wore on, the occurrences grew more intense. One afternoon, as the workers were hauling away a pile of rubble, a sound stopped them in their tracks. It was faint at first, like a soft murmur carried by the wind, but it grew louder, becoming a series of whispers that seemed to circle them, darting from one direction to another. "What the hell is that?" one of the men muttered, his eyes wide as he scanned the area. The whispers were incoherent, a jumble of voices speaking in hushed, frantic tones. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. Another worker shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. But it's creeping me out." He turned to the others. Maybe we should take a break. Before they could respond, the whispers abruptly ceased, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. The workers exchanged nervous glances, but with a hesitant nod from Mr. Dean, they continued their work, trying to shake off the eerie encounter. Jake and Leo, who had been watching from a distance, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in their stomachs. The whispering had sent chills through them, stirring memories of the haunting wail they had planted in the house. But they forced themselves to dismiss it, attributing it to the workers' nerves and the stressful conditions. Yet, the whispers were only the beginning. That night, as the last of the workers packed up and left, the construction site lay in darkness, the shadows stretching long and deep across the ground. Jake and Leo had stayed behind, tasked with locking up the equipment. As they made their rounds, checking the machinery and tools, a sound stopped them cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, echoing through the still night air. "Did you hear that?" Leo whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the darkness that surrounded them. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, probably just one of the workers forgot something. I'll check it out." He took a tentative step forward, peering into the inky blackness between the skeletal remains of the demolished house. "Hello," he called, his voice wavering slightly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps ceased, replaced by an unnerving silence. Jake held his breath, straining to listen for any hint of movement. A few seconds passed, and then a faint sound reached his ears. It was high-pitched and haunting, like the cry of a child. It rose and fell, a mournful wail that sent a wave of cold terror coursing through his veins. Leo breathed, his voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" It sounded like a kid. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. He knew that cry. It was the same recording they had planted in the house weeks ago. But how could it be here now, when the phone was long gone and the house had been reduced to rubble? "It's just the wind," Jake muttered, though he could barely convince himself. "It's nothing. Let's just finish up and go home." They continued their tasks, but every sound, every creak of metal, and every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. The cry seemed to linger in the air, faint but constant, echoing through the ruins like a ghostly lament. It followed them as they moved, prickling the back of their necks and sending shivers down their spines. By the time they finished, their hands were trembling, their faces pale. They locked up quickly, eager to leave the site behind and retreat to the safety of their home. But even as they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, following them into the darkness. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. The workers reported hearing footsteps behind them when no one else was around. Tools would fly off tables as if knocked over by invisible hands. Shadows darted in the corners of their vision, vanishing the moment they turned to look. One morning, as the workers gathered to start their day, a low, chilling murmur filled the air. It was a child's voice, soft and distant, singing an eerie, tuneless melody. The men froze, their eyes wide as they listened, horror etched across their faces. The song carried on for a few minutes, then faded into silence, leaving them standing in stunned fear. Jake and Leo were present when it happened, and for the first time they felt true panic gnawing at their insides. This was no mere trick of the wind or faulty equipment. There was something out there, something that defied logic and explanation. "It's just our nerves," Jake insisted later that day, his voice tight as he paced back and forth in their father's study. "We're working long hours, we're stressed. It's making us hear things. Leo sat on the edge of a chair, his hands clasped together to stop them from shaking. No, Jake, this isn't just stress. I'm telling you, there's something wrong with that place. We shouldn't have gone in there. We shouldn't have stopped. Jake snapped, whirling to face his brother, his eyes wild. We're not talking about that, understand? It was a trick, a recording. Nothing else, but even as he said it, his words rang hollow. Deep down, they both knew there was more to this than they were willing to admit. The house, the land, it was angry. It had absorbed Emma's despair, her pain, and now it was lashing out. Days passed, and the occurrences grew more sinister. Workers reported feeling a cold hand brush against their skin, only to turn and find no one there. A heavy, suffocating presence filled the air, weighing down on their chests and stealing their breath. Some claimed to hear faint whispers in their ears, soft voices pleading for help or crying out in agony. One evening, as Jake and Leo prepared to leave the site, they heard it again, the child's cry, louder and clearer than before. It seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through the ruins, filling their heads with its haunting wail. I can't take this anymore, Leo stammered, backing away. We need to stop this, Jake. We need to get out of here. But Jake stood frozen, his eyes locked on a spot in the darkness where he thought he saw movement, a small figure, hunched and pale, standing silently amidst the rubble. He turned slowly, its hollow eyes gleaming in the faint light, and Jake felt a scream clawing at his throat. Jake, Leo shouted, grabbing his brother's arm and pulling him away. Come on, we have to go. With a strangled gasp, Jake tore his gaze away from the figure and stumbled backward. They sprinted to their car, slamming the door shut and peeling out of the sight as fast as they could. The creaks followed them, echoing in their ears even as they sped away, relentless and accusing. That night, sleep eluded them both. They lay in their beds, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness as the echoes of the cries and whispers filled their minds. There was no escaping it now. The land had awoken, and it was not content to let them go so easily. The haunting had begun, and it had taken root in their very souls. Part 6. Leo's Death. The night was unusually cold for the time of year. A harsh wind howled through the village, rattling the windows of the Dean household and filling the air with a chilling, unnatural presence. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating, as if the house itself had begun to breathe with a sinister rhythm. The Deans had tried to carry on with their lives, ignoring the eerie events that plagued the construction site, dismissing them as mere coincidences or tricks of the mind. But tonight something was different. Something had shifted, and the darkness that clung to the village seemed to be closing in. Leo sat in his room, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, following the faint patterns of shadows cast by the moonlight through the curtains. He had not been able to sleep for days, haunted by the cries and whispers that filled his ears every time he closed his eyes. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside made him jump, his nerves fraying at the edges. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling, and opened the messaging app hovering over Jake's contact. He wanted to call his brother to tell him about the oppressive fear that had taken root in his chest, but he hesitated. Jake would just brush it off, tell him he was being paranoid, that they needed to man up and get over it. No one believed what he was feeling, this growing sense of doom that tightened around him like a vice. The room grew colder, and Leo shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The wind outside picked up, howling louder, and he could swear he heard a faint wail riding on the ghost, a child's cry that sent a spike of fear through his heart. He pressed his hands to his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. It's not real, it's not real, it's not real, he muttered to himself, rocking back and forth. It's just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. He had seen the shadowy figure, heard the whispers and cries. There was something out there, something they had disturbed when they invaded Emma's home, and it was angry. It wanted them to pay for what they had done. Minutes felt like hours as he sat there, lost in his own terror. Then, slowly, the temperature in the room dropped further, plunging to an almost unbearable chill. His breath misted in the air, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift and twist. Leo's eyes snapped open, his pulse quickening as he scanned the darkness. A faint creaking sound echoed from the ceiling above him. He looked up, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The ceiling fan swayed slightly, as if moved by an unseen force. His mouth went dry, and he could feel the icy grip of fear tighten around his throat. The fan creaked again, louder this time, the sound filling the room with an ominous echo. Jack, he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. He wanted to get up, to run to his brother's room, but his legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. The room seemed to press in on him, the walls closing, the shadows creeping ever closer. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, so close to his ear that he felt the cold breath against his skin. "You shouldn't have come," Leo screamed, a blood-curdling sound that tore through the silence of the house. He stumbled to his feet, his heart racing, eyes darting around the room wildly. The shadows seemed to move, to writhe and stretch out towards him, and from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was small, hunched, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the faint light. Leo's blood ran cold as he recognized it, the same figure that had haunted them at the construction site. "Get away," he shouted, backing up against the wall. His hands fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The room filled with the sound of whispers, a cacophony of voices speaking in hushed, frantic tones. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Leo could see its face now, twisted into a hideous grin, its mouth opening wide as it let out a high-pitched, keening wail. His vision blurred, and his head spun as the air around him grew impossibly cold. The fan above him creaked louder, swaying violently. He glanced up, his heart skipping a beat. A noose dangled from the fan's blade, swaying gently as if beckoning him. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the darkness closed in around him. "No," he choked out, his eyes wide with terror. "Please." "I didn't mean to." The room grew darker, the shadows swirling like a vortex, pulling him in. The whispers intensified, echoing inside his head, drowning out his thoughts. And then, the noose descended, snaking towards him as if it had a life of its own. Leo's screams echoed through the house, piercing the quiet of the night. Jack bolted upright in his bed, his heart racing. "Leo," he called, stumbling out of his room and into the hallway. His blood ran cold when he heard the thud from his brother's room. He sprinted down the corridor, his mind racing with fear and confusion. When he flung open the door, what he saw made his stomach twist into knots. Leo hung from the ceiling fan, his body swaying gently, his face twisted in a rictus of horror. His eyes were wide open, staring sightlessly into the darkness, his mouth agape in a silent scream. The room was ice cold, and an oppressive silence filled the air, as if the house itself had paused to witness the grim scene. Jake staggered backward, a strangled cry escaping his throat. No, this can't be happening," he gasped, his hands trembling. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, staring up at his brother's lifeless form in disbelief. Leo, no!" The commotion brought Mr. and Mrs. Dean rushing to the room. Mrs. Dean screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as she beheld the sight of her son hanging from the fan. Mr. Dean, his face pale, pushed past her and grabbed Jake by the shoulders, shaking him. "What happened?" he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear. "What did you do?" Jake could only shake his head, his eyes wide and filled with horror. I don't know," he stammered. "I heard him scream and then..." Mr. Dean released his grip, stumbling backward as he looked up at Leo's body. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, but he refused to let his mind accept what it was screaming at him. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. "It's an accident," he muttered to himself, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an explanation. He must have climbed up there for some reason. It's just a tragic accident. That's all, but deep inside, a seed of doubt had been planted. He could feel it growing, gnawing at his resolve, whispering insidious thoughts that he fought to silence. The room felt alive with an energy that he couldn't understand, a cold malevolence that wrapped around his throat, squeezing until he could barely breathe. Mrs. Dean sobbed uncontrollably, collapsing into a chair as she buried her face in her hands. Oh God, why she wailed. "This is all our fault. We shouldn't have done it. We shouldn't have gone after that land." Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, as if in agreement. The village stirred with the news of Leo's death, the tragedy sending a ripple of fear and grim satisfaction through the tight-knit community. Word spread quickly, whispered from house to house, the Deans are cursed. It's karma for what they did to Emma, the villagers spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim as they recounted the cruelty of the Dean family. "You can't do what they did and expect to get away with it," an old woman muttered, shaking her head. "This is the price they pay for their greed and heartlessness." By the next morning, the Dean household was filled with a heavy silence. broken only by the occasional sob from Mrs. Dean or the shuffle of feet as Mr. Dean moved aimlessly through the halls. Jake sat in his room, staring blankly at the wall. The image of Leo's lifeless body burned into his mind. He could still hear the whispers, feel the cold presence that had filled the room that night. There was no denying it, now something was haunting them, something they had awoken with their greed and malice. Mr. Dean, however, refused to accept the truth. He buried himself in his work, focusing on the construction site, determined to push forward. It was an accident, he repeated to anyone who would listen. There's nothing supernatural here, just tragedy, pure and simple. But the villagers knew better. They saw the fear in the Dean family's eyes, the shadows that loomed over their house. The curse had begun, and it would not stop until it had claimed what it sought. The whispers of retribution, of karma, filled the air around the Dean household, wrapping around it like a noose, tightening with each passing day. And somewhere in the darkness, the vengeful spirit of Emma and her son waited, their presence growing stronger, feeding on the fear and anguish of those who had wronged them. The Deans had opened a door to something far beyond their understanding, and now there would be no escape from the horrors that lurked in the shadows. Part 7. Jake's Madness. Jake's sanity was slipping away, like sand trickling through his fingers. He could feel it happening, but he was powerless to stop it. Ever since Leo's death, his world had been unraveling, each day blurring into the next. Sleep was a distant memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he was bombarded by twisted nightmares that left him gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, and clawing at his cheeks. Shadows crept along his bedroom walls at night, whispering secrets and horrors he was too terrified to comprehend. Jake lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his eyes bloodshot and wild. The room around him felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. He could hear the whispers again faint, hissing murmurs that crawled into his ears and wrapped around his brain like a vice. "It's your fault. You brought this on yourself," the voices hissed, filling his head with accusations and curses. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands to his ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside him, gnawing at his sanity. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice echoing off the walls of his room. His body convulsed as he curled into a fetal position, shivering uncontrollably, but the voices only grew louder, overlapping, until they became a cacophony of torment that threatened to split his mind in two. Images flashed before his closed eyes, Emma's face, gaunt and twisted in agony, her eyes wide and accusing. He saw Leo hanging from the ceiling fan, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes staring right at Jake with a gaze that pierced through to his very soul. Jake gasped for air, feeling as though an invisible hand was squeezing his throat. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping to an unnatural chill. He opened his eyes, and in the dim light of his bedroom, he saw them figures standing in the corners of the room, their faces shrouded in shadow. They moved slowly, creeping toward him with every blink. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he scrambled off the bed, backing into the corner. "Get away from me," he shrieked, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "You're not real. You're not real." But deep down, he knew they were real, more real than anything else in his life right now. He could feel their presence, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on him, squeezing the sanity from his mind. It was as if the house had become a living entity, filled with the malevolent spirits of those they had wronged. The walls whispered, the floors creaked, and every corner seemed to hide a shadow waiting to lunge at him. Jake stumbled to the bathroom, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the light switch. Harsh, white light flooded the room, momentarily banishing the darkness that clawed at him. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles turning white as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. His own face stared back at him, gaunt and hollow, eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. "You did this," he whispered to his reflection, his voice cracking. You brought this curse upon us." The mirror began to fog over, despite the room being cold. Jake watched in horror as words began to scrawl themselves across the glass, as if written by an invisible hand. "You will pay." The letters were jagged, dripping as though they had been carved into the very surface of the mirror. "No," Jake breathed, stumbling backward. "No, this isn't happening." The bathroom light flickered, then went out, plunging him into darkness. Jake let out a strangled scream and bolted from the room, crashing into the hallway. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, the blood roaring in his ears. He felt the house closing in around him, the walls narrowing, the darkness growing thicker. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. Without thinking, he rushed toward the front door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the night. The wind howled around him, biting at his skin as he ran blindly down the path toward the construction site. He didn't know why he was running there, only that some force was pulling him, guiding him toward the place where it had all begun. The village was silent, asleep in the darkness. Only the sound of his labored breathing and the pounding of his footsteps filled the air as he made his way through the empty streets. His mind was a whirlpool of fear, anger, and confusion, spinning wildly out of control. He could hear voices behind him, whispering his name, taunting him with cries of pain and torment. Jake, they called, echoing in his ears. You can't escape. As he reached the construction site, a skeletal frame of what was to be a new building standing against the moonlit sky. The wind howled through the metal beams, creating an eerie symphony that filled the air with an otherworldly chill. Jake stumbled onto the site, gasping for breath, his eyes wild and darting around as if expecting the shadows to leap at him at any moment. Show yourselves, he screamed into the darkness, his voice cracking. Come out and face me. But the only response was the creaking of the beams and the rustling of the wind. He staggered forward, moving deeper into the site, his eyes fixed on the unfinished building ahead, the third floor, high and ominous, looming over him like a giant ready to swallow him whole. An uncontrollable urge gripped him, pulling him toward it. He had to go up. He had to go out. He had to face whatever was haunting him. Jake moved as if in a trance, his feet dragging him toward the structure. He climbed the makeshift stairs, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The higher he went, the colder it became, the air turning thick and heavy, pressing against his skin like an icy shroud. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. Your fault. You can't run. You belong to us. Finally, he reached the third floor. The wind whipped around him, tearing at his clothes. As he stood on the edge of the platform, he looked out over the village, his eyes glazed with madness. The voices in his head were screaming now, a relentless cacophony that drowned out every rational thought. They swirled around him, tugging at his sanity, driving him to the brink. In that moment, he saw them again, Emma and Leo, standing at the far end of the floor. Their faces were gaunt and twisted, their eyes hollow and filled with an unholy light. Emma's mouth open, stretching impossibly wide, as she let out a haunting wail that reverberated through his skull. No, Jake screamed, clutching his head as he backed away. Leave me alone. But they moved closer, their forms distorting and shifting, turning into grotesque apparitions that filled his vision with horror. The platform beneath him seemed to tilt, swaying precariously as if it were alive. The air was filled with the scent of decay, of death, choking him as he gasped for breath. Ended, the voices hissed. Join us. His mind snapped, like a thread stretched too far. With a strangled cry, he lunged toward the edge of the platform, his legs propelling him forward in a frenzied dash. In his last fleeting moment of clarity, he felt the icy grip of despair tighten around his heart. There was no escape from this darkness. It had claimed him, body and soul. He threw himself off the edge. The fall seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Wind roared past his ears, his body weightless as he plummeted through the darkness. He caught a glimpse of the ground rushing up to meet him, a blur of shadows and light. And then impact. The sound echoed through the construction site like a thunderclap, sharp and final. His body hit the ground with a sickening crunch, limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and viscous, soaking into the earth that had once been Emma's. The village awoke to the sound of distant screams. People rushed out of their homes, drawn by the commotion at the construction site. What they found there made their blood run cold. Jake lay crumpled on the ground, his eyes staring sightlessly up at the sky, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. His body was shattered, broken by the fall, but it was his face that horrified them the most. The look of sheer terror etched into his features spoke of the madness that had consumed him in his final moments. Whispers spread like wildfire through the village. The second death in the Dean family sent shockwaves of fear and superstition. The curse, they murmured, their voices quivering. The curse is real. It's karma for their sins. Mr. Dean arrived at the scene, his face ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared down at the broken body of his last surviving son, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Not his family. He sank to his knees, his mouth opening in a silent scream of anguish. The villagers gathered at a distance, their faces a mix of horror and grim satisfaction. The curse had claimed another victim, and the Dean's punishment was far from over. As the sun rose over the construction site, casting a pale light over the tragic scene, an unnatural silence settled over the village. Somewhere in the shadows, the echoes. Part 8. Mrs. Dean's Encounter. The Dean household had turned into a realm of despair and dread. After the deaths of her sons, Mrs. Dean drifted through the halls like a ghost herself, eyes hollow, face gone. Each room felt colder, more oppressive, as if the house itself had absorbed the grief and fear that now permeated every corner. The laughter and warmth that had once filled the rooms were replaced with an eerie, uncomfortable silence. The air was thick with the scent of decay, though Mrs. Dean couldn't tell if it was just her imagination or something else entirely. She had grown increasingly paranoid, constantly glancing over her shoulder, jumping at the slightest creak or whisper in the house. Every shadow seemed to hide a sinister figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a mournful wail. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The few times she managed to close her eyes, she was haunted by visions of her sons, twisted faces, screaming silently in the darkness. She felt trapped in a nightmare from which she could not wake. "It's not real," she muttered to herself, wringing her hands as she paced her bedroom. "They're gone. It's just grief playing tricks on me," but deep down Mrs. Dean knew the truth. The house was no longer theirs. It belonged to something darker, something malevolent that had claimed her family, one by one. It was the curse, the one the villagers whispered about behind closed doors, the one she had dismissed as mere superstition. Now, that curse was tightening its grip around her, and she could feel it squeezing the life out of her. As night fell, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Mrs. Dean sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was a stranger, eyes sunken, skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her hair, once neatly styled, hung limp and disheveled. She reached up to smooth it, but her hand shook uncontrollably. A sudden chill filled the room, and she shivered. The temperature seemed to drop even further, turning the air around her icy. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, glancing nervously at the dark corners of the room. The house groaned as the wind howled outside, but there was something else, a faint sound, like distant crying. Mrs. Dean's heart skipped a beat, and she strained to listen. Nothing. Silence. With a shuddering sigh, she turned back to the mirror, attempting to steady her breathing. "Just my nerves," she whispered to herself, forcing a weak smile. Nothing more than my nerves, but then she felt it. A cold, clammy touch on the back of her hand. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing as a wave of dread washed over her. It was unmistakable, the sensation of fingers, icy and thin, wrapping around her hand. For a moment she couldn't breathe, her eyes wide with terror. Slowly trembling, she turned to look over her shoulder. The blood drained from her face, and a strangled gasp escaped her lips. There, standing behind her, was the ghostly form of Emma. Emma's face was twisted in a grotesque mask of anger and sorrow. Her eyes, hollow and lifeless, bored into Mrs. Dean's with a fury that seemed to pierce her very soul. Her mouth was contorted into a grimace, lips pale and cracked, as if she had been screaming for an eternity. Her skin, sickly grey and translucent, made her look more like a wraith than a human being. "No," Mrs. Dean choked out, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to move, to get up, but her body refused to obey. She was paralyzed, trapped in place by sheer terror. Emma's hand remained on hers, the touch searing her skin with its icy grip. The ghost didn't speak. It merely stood there, staring, its presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. Mrs. Dean's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a burning sensation in her throat, as if a scream were trying to force its way out but couldn't. Her gaze flickered to the vanity mirror, and she nearly collapsed from shock. In the reflection, Emma wasn't standing behind her. She was directly in the mirror, staring back at Mrs. Dean, her eyes filled with hatred. Then, the phone on the vanity rang. The shrill sound cut through the air like a knife, making Mrs. Dean jump. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned her head toward the phone, its old-fashioned rotary dial illuminated by the dim light of the room. She knew that phone. It was the one they had used to scare the villagers, the one rigged to play the eerie wails they had recorded. But that phone had been disconnected. How could it be ringing? The room around her seemed to close in, the air growing colder and heavier. The phone continued to ring, each shrill tone echoing in her ears, vibrating through her bones. With a trembling hand, she reached out to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the cold receiver. She hesitated, a voice in her mind screaming at her not to answer, to run, to flee from the house and never look back. But something else compelled her to lift the receiver to her ear. As soon as she did, the phone fell silent. A heavy, unnatural quiet filled the room, pressing against her eardrums. Mrs. Dean's breath hitched, and she strained to listen, every nerve in her body taut. Then it came. A wail, long and mournful, erupted from the phone speaker, filling the room with a sound so terrible it made her blood run cold. It was the same wail they had used to frighten others, but this time it was different. This time it was real, filled with anguish and fury. The cries rose and fell, echoing around the room, growing louder, more distorted, until they became an unbearable cacophony of torment. No Mrs. Dean screamed, topping the phone. It clattered to the floor, but the wails continued, seeping into the walls, the floor, the very air around her. She staggered back, her hands flying to her ears in a desperate attempt to block out the sound, but it was no use. The wails filled her mind, drowning her thoughts in a sea of horror. Her vision blurred, and she collapsed to her knees, clutching her throat as if something was strangling her. The room spun around her, the darkness closing in, and she felt an invisible force squeezing her neck. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. Emma's face loomed before her, eyes burning with a hatred that made Mrs. Dean's heart seize in fear. The ghostly figure reached out, its hand hovering over Mrs. Dean's, guiding them to wrap around her own throat. Mrs. Dean's eyes widened, terror and agony twisting her features into a grimace of horror. She tried to fight it, to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The pressure around her neck increased, her vision dimming as the room swirled in a whirlpool of shadows and craze. Her fingers tightened, digging into her skin, as if possessed, crushing her windpipe with an inexorable strength. "No, please," she gasped, her last words barely a whisper. And then, with a final, strangled breath, she slumped forward, collapsing onto the vanity. Her hands remained wrapped tightly around her neck, her eyes frozen in a wide, glassy stare of pure terror. The room fell silent, the air heavy and still. The phone on the floor emitted a low, crackling hum, and then, once again, the wails filled the room soft, echoing cries that faded into a mournful silence. Mrs. Dean was dead. Her body lay motionless on the floor, twisted in an unnatural pose, her face contorted into a look of sheer horror. Her hands were locked around her neck, the fingers curled tightly, as if she had choked the life out of herself. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows of the Dean household. The villagers who had gathered outside watched the scene from afar, their faces pale and somber. Word spread quickly through the town. Mrs. Dean had died, clutching her throat as if fighting off an unseen force. "It's a curse," they whispered, their voices filled with a mix of fear and grim satisfaction. "The curse of Emma. It has claimed another." And in the dark corners of the house, the shadows stirred, the presence of something angry and restless lingering in the air. Emma's spirit had made her claim, and the vengeance that had been set in motion showed no signs of stopping. As the wails echoed through the empty hallways of the Dean household, the villagers turned away, their hearts heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The curse had spread its darkness, and the Dean family had paid a price far greater than they could have ever imagined. Part 9. The curse fulfilled. The morning after Mrs. Dean's death, a thick, eerie fog blanketed the village. The air was cold and still, as if the world itself had paused to hold its breath. The Dean household loomed in the distance, shrouded in mist and silence, a dark monument to the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Its windows, once bright with pride and wealth, now stared out like hollow eyes, watching the village with a menacing emptiness. It was a day the villagers would not soon forget. The news of Mrs. Dean's demise had spread quickly, carried on whispers and hushed conversations. People gathered in small groups, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and grim acceptance. They had seen it coming, in a way. The Dean family had meddled with something far beyond their understanding, and now the full weight of the curse had come crashing down upon them. The villagers approached the Dean household with a sense of trepidation, moving as one body towards the scene of the latest tragedy. There was an air of finality in their steps, as though they were walking toward the conclusion of a dark tale that had haunted them for weeks. They pushed open the creaking front door, the chill from inside washing over them like a wave of death. Inside, the house was dark, shadows lingering in every corner. The air was thick and stagnant, carrying the faint scent of decay and something more, a bitterness, a sense of deep-rooted sorrow that clung to every surface. The floorboards creaked underfoot as they moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the dimly lit rooms for any sign of life. But there was nothing, only silence and the oppressive weight of despair. When they reached Mrs. Dean's bedroom, they stopped, a collective gasp escaping their lips. There, slumped over the vanity table, was Mrs. Dean's lifeless body. Her hands were still wrapped tightly around her neck, frozen in a death grip that told of a struggle beyond mortal comprehension. Her eyes stared wide and glassy at her reflection in the mirror, capturing the last horrifying moments of her encounter with the vengeful spirit. The villagers exchanged glances, their faces pale and drawn. No one dared to speak at first, the sight before them confirming what they had already begun to suspect. The Dean family had been utterly consumed by a curse, one of their own making. They had pushed too far, greedily taking what wasn't theirs, and in the end they had paid a price far greater than they could have ever imagined. "It's the curse," an old woman finally whispered, her voice trembling as she crossed herself. "Emma and her son. They've claimed their revenge." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight of Mrs. Dean's twisted form, while others simply stared, the weight of the tragedy pressing down on them like a dark cloud. The Dean family, once so powerful and feared in the village, was now nothing more than a grim cautionary tale. The land they had coveted, the source of their obsession and greed, remained barren. It lay just beyond the house, a plot of dirt and rubble where Emma's home had once stood. No matter how much work they had put into clearing it, nothing had ever seemed to take root. The construction site was still and desolate, the air around it heavy with an unsettling presence. The workers had long since abandoned it, refusing to return after the hauntings that had driven them away in terror. The villagers stood in silence, casting nervous glances toward the empty land. They could almost feel the eyes of Emma and her son upon them, watching, waiting. The whispers in the air grew louder, faint cries that seemed to rise up from the earth itself, filling their ears with a sorrow that seeped into their very bones. "Leave this place," a voice murmured among them, the village priest stepping forward with a grim expression on his face. "This ground is cursed. Nothing good will ever come from it," the villagers nodded, stepping back from the house as if it might lash out and claim them too. They moved slowly, filing out of the room and down the hallways, their footsteps echoing like a funeral procession. Outside, the folk still hung thick in the air, muffling their words and movements as they gathered in front of the house. As they looked back at the Dean estate, now a shell of its former grandeur, they felt a sense of closure mingled with fear. The curse had come full circle. The family who had once terrorized others with their greed and cruelty had met a fate so horrific that it chilled the very marrow of their bones. There was no doubt in their minds the spirits of Emma and her son would haunt this place forever, guarding it against any who dared to tread upon it with ill intent. "It's as if the land itself rejected them," another villager muttered, shaking his head. "They thought they could take whatever they wanted. They were wrong. The fog around the land seemed to thicken, curling around the barren plot like ghostly fingers. It was a place marked by suffering, where the echoes of Emma's despair and David's cry still lingered, embedded in the soil itself. It would remain untouched, a grim reminder of the consequences that come from crossing the boundaries of greed and cruelty." In the days that followed, the Dean house stood empty, abandoned by both the living and the dead. The villagers stayed away, giving their estate a wide berth as they went about their daily lives. Some swore they could hear wails at night, carried on the wind from the direction of the old construction site. Others spoke of seeing shadows move behind the windows of the house, figures that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. The land was cursed of that, there was no question. It had consumed the Deans, swallowed them whole in a retribution that seemed almost biblical in its severity. The once proud family, known for their wealth and power, was now reduced to a memory shrouded in darkness and fear. The story of the Deans became a cautionary tale told among the villagers. They spoke of it in hushed tones around fireplaces, and in the market square, their voices low and serious. It was a tale of greed, cruelty, and the inevitable hand of justice that came down upon those who trampled over the lives of others. "Remember the Deans," they would say to their children, warning them against the dangers of unchecked ambition. Remember how their greed led them to ruin, how they were cursed by the spirits of the innocent they tormented. The land they had coveted remained barren, a scar upon the earth that no one dared to heal. No flowers grew there, no grass took root. It was a place of death and sorrow, a place where shadows moved on their own and whispers carried through the air long into the night. Occasionally, a passerby would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of their eye, a figure standing among the ruins, watching with eyes that gleamed in the moonlight. The figure of a woman, her face etched with sadness and rage, and beside her, a small boy holding her hand, their forms blending into the mist as quickly as they appeared. The villagers knew what they had seen, though they seldom spoke of it. It was a reminder that some wrongs could not be forgiven, that some sins lingered on far beyond the lives of those who committed them. The Ding family's legacy was not one of wealth or power, but of tragedy and loss, a testament to the darkness that greed and cruelty could sow. And so, the story of the Dings faded into legend, the house left to rot, and the land untouched. The village moved on, but the curse remained, a silent, ever-present warning that there are forces in this world not to be trifled with, forces that watch and wait to exact justice on those who think themselves beyond reproach. The curse had fulfilled its grim promise. The Deans were gone, their dreams of wealth and dominance buried beneath the rubble of their greed. The spirits of Emma and her son roamed the land they had died protecting, ensuring that it would never fall into the hands of those who might seek to exploit it again. And on nights when the wind howled through the village, carrying with it the faint cries of a mother and her child, the villagers would close their doors and bow their heads, remembering the price that had been paid. The land stood as a monument to their suffering, a place where the restless dead kept watch, a dark reminder that some forces, once awakened, could never be put to rest. In the end, it was not wealth or power that defined the Dean's legacy, but the haunting echoes of a curse that had taken everything from them. The tale served as a stark lesson to all who heard it that greed, unchecked and ruthless, would ultimately lead to a reckoning far more terrifying than any could imagine.